Hi everyone. So this is going to be our lecture for Tuesday, 10/31, Halloween, the day that we will not meet in class, but we're still accounting for that class meeting by having our lecture online. I'm going to post this lecture in probably 3 segments. I'm aiming for 2 hour and 15-minute total duration of recorded time that will also be the amount of time that it will take you to watch and take notes. And I'm going to post it in probably either 2 or 3 segments because simply because it's easier to upload the video file to YouTube if it's shorter, as opposed to one 2 hour 15-minute video. If I have 3 shorter ones, it's easier. Okay, so where we left off last time is we had started some of the material for Chapter 7. Now, this lecture is going to focus potentially exclusively on Chapter 7. If we get through Chapter 7, then I only have a couple of slides on Chapter 8, and that brings us to the end of Module 3. The next module, Module 4, is going to cover your textbook chapters 9, 10, and 11. I talk very, very little about Chapter 11. For the most part, I sort of ignore it. I won't even assign it to you as reading. So we'll see how far we get in this online recording, and then we'll pick up from there next week. The following week, you are going to have your second exam, which will cover modules 3 and 4. If we do not get all the way through module 4, then whatever we don't cover will not be on your second test. It will go onto your final exam. I don't anticipate us being behind because we're making really good time as far as what we're covering, but we'll see how things go. All right, so when we were leaving off in class on this past Tuesday, we were talking about the French Revolution. And remember, one of the options for the essay question on your exam is going to be to talk about the differences between the French and the American Revolutions. There are a couple of things in general that I do want you all to know, and I will make sure to point that out. In other words, there are a couple of things that I tend to ask as multiple choice questions about the French Revolution, or the relationship the United States has with France in general in the 1780s, 1790s, and going into the beginning of the 19th century. And so my lecture, my slides on the French Revolution are somewhat detailed. I've minimized them over the years, but this is a huge topic. There are people who spend their entire careers focusing on just one aspect of the French Revolution. And so I don't want you to feel overwhelmed by the details that I'm giving you. I have to explain things a bit so that you understand the difference between how and why the French Revolution happened and how and why the American Revolution happened. And then I have a slide that sums up some of the differences between the two. Okay, so last time we went through this slide, I talked about the Ancien Regime, how French society is divided into the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. And I told you that the commoners make up the vast majority of people living in France. And we continued and talked about how the French crown is in debt. France is a monarchy. It is not at this time a constitutional monarchy, which is what Britain is at this point in time. In other words, there is no parliament to sort of check the power of the king, as is the general intention in Britain. And so we have this this pair of monarchs, King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, who are pretty poor at leading their country. In other words, they know that their country is in need of money, their treasury is in need of money, and they know that when their people are suffering, they're still going to continue to spend frivolously, have lots of fancy parties, and not really do much proactively to try and help the commoners, who are very highly affected from food shortages and famines and crop failures, essentially, that will create starvation among the common people. And so we sort of talked about that here. Okay, so there are crop failures, the price of food goes up, there's a lot of starvation for those who do work in, for someone else, as opposed to being a subsistence farmer, living on land, growing crops. And we have these crop failures where people are starving in the rural areas, and then people are also unable to find work in the cities. But we're going to focus mostly here in regards to the French Revolution on what's happening in cities. So this is where we had left off. So there's a meeting called, there's a meeting that is called to order, and the meeting is called the Estates General. And essentially, what this means is the three estates, member of the Ancien Regime, they are the nobility, the clergy, and the commoners, are going to get together and discuss, particularly here, issues of financial reform. Okay, so the problems with the money in France at the time. And this meeting is held at Versailles. And Versailles is where the royal palace is. You can go there. It's beautiful. It has beautiful grounds, and you can take tours. It's very interesting. Now, the thing is that this meeting is called in May of 1789, but the last time it had met had been 150 years earlier. So it had been quite some time since representatives from these three estates had gotten together to make decisions about the country as a whole. Typically, this meeting, it was not something that was always in session. Now, the purpose of this meeting is really twofold. The main purpose is to create financial reform. Okay, so we need some type of financial reform in France. But the second purpose, and this is the purpose coming from the desires of the nobility, the clergy, the monarchy, is to keep the commoners from rebelling. Okay, so the second purpose is to keep the commoners from rebelling. Now here's the thing, you don't have to write this, but in general, it was not uncommon, going back centuries, for common people in an area to respond to grievances by going and protesting to the local monarch. That was not uncommon, but typically the rebellion could be addressed, it could be dealt with. So when I say that they're trying to keep the commoners from rebelling, it's not as if the king and queen saw a revolution in the near future. It was more of a way that people could demonstrate their grievances under a monarchy type of system, right? Because you can't vote out the king and the queen if the king becomes a king by birth and then the queen becomes queen by marriage. It's not like having a president where you are unhappy so you can elect the person out, or there's always the potential for impeachment, or something along those lines. The president is not president forever, and there are measures to remove him or her if it is deemed necessary. But that doesn't exist in a monarchy. So this idea of having the commoners rebel is not completely unexpected, but I don't want to give you the impression that people assumed that there was a major revolution about to happen. Okay. Let me talk about this for a second, and then I'll tell you what to write after the ... here. So in the Estates General, which is this, it's sort of like a Congress, but it's, there are representatives for the three estates. There's representatives for the clergy, representatives for the nobility, and representatives for the commoners. So even though we have the fact that the commoners are so much more numerous. The population of France is almost all made up of commoners. So even though they make up the majority, they can be outvoted by the other two estates. So in other words, if you have three different groups, first estate, second estate, third estate, and you're voting on a proposition or an issue, and each estate gets one vote. Order and estate mean the same thing. So when I say voting by order, you can also think voting by estate. So the clergy gets one vote, the nobility gets one vote, and the commoners get one vote. And the problem with that is that the interests of the clergy and the nobility are much more closely aligned. So if they're going to vote for something that is against what the commoners want, then they are going to have the majority, even though together the clergy and the nobility still make up such a small minority of the population in France. So if you want something to write here, voting by order meant the third estate, aka the commoners. So voting by order meant the third estate, aka the commoners, can always be outvoted. Okay, so that's the problem that we're going to see come up in the very beginning of this meeting of the Estates General. So the third estate proposes something different. They say they want voting by head. They want each representative who is there, and actually the commoners have more representatives than the clergy and the nobility have, sitting in this meeting of the Estate General, and they think that every person there should get a vote. So instead of saying each order gets one vote, it's more of like majority rules type of thing. But the first two orders do not agree to this, and the meeting is stalemated for several weeks. So the third estate leaves and makes their own meeting. So that's what I would write there. The third estate leaves and makes their own meeting. And this meeting is going to be called the National Assembly. Now, who is going to attend this National Assembly? It's going to be the members of the Third Estate. Eventually, as time goes by and things get much more contentious, some members of the clergy and then members of the nobility will also come and join them at their meeting as well. And voting is by head in the National Assembly. So the purpose of this meeting is that they are going to draft a constitution. Okay, so they want to write a constitution. They want their king to be held responsible to some measure of the law that they deem is fair. Okay, so the purpose is to draft a constitution. It doesn't mean you're going to get rid of a king. You can have a constitutional monarchy, right? That's possible. But in France in this time period, there was not yet a constitution. Okay, so all right, so King Louis's response is that he seems to support this idea. Okay, so he seems to support, but he sends soldiers to Paris, which is where this is happening. Okay, so he seems to support this, but he's actually going to send thousands of soldiers to go march on Paris. And this really frustrates the members of the National Assembly. So I'll give you a minute to write this. You don't have to write this quote on the side. I'll just talk about it for a minute once we go through this slide here. Okay, if you're still writing, that's okay. You don't have to add anything here. I'm going to talk about this a little bit. And if you know anything at all about the French Revolution, then you've probably talked about the fall of the Bastille before. All right, so what ends up happening is, we have the National Assembly meeting. They're trying to draft this constitution. The king is going to send thousands of troops to Paris. People get nervous and suspicious about why he's doing that, and so they arm themselves. So they actually go to a different location. I can't recall the name of it, where they're trying to take arms and gunpowder, and the gunpowder had been moved a few days prior to the Bastille, which is a prison, but it's sort of seen as this big symbol of the monarchy in France. And so these people who are able to acquire weapons at the first place they go, they would like to also acquire gunpowder, which is being held at this prison. So they're going to steal grain. They're going to steal arms. First of all, they want the grain to feed themselves because they are experiencing this crisis with the food supply. But they also steal arms because they want to be able to defend themselves, since they aren't sure what's going to happen with these troops that Louis has stationed in Paris. They're going to march to this prison, and I have a painting. It's a very famous event. And this is a depiction, and this is in July of 1789, and these rebels, these protesters, go and they storm this prison. There were actually only 7 prisoners at the time, but it was more of a symbolic type of thing. And they destroy it. They tear it to the ground. They find the leader. If you can see him, I can't see my cursor, but he's the man sort of pictured in the middle here. Not the leader, but sort of the overseer, I guess, of the prison. He's called the governor of the prison, which I think is a sort of a tricky term for us to understand, because we always think of governor meaning like the head of a state here. But basically, he's in charge of the prison. So they take him, they stab him to death, they cut off his head, they put it on a spike, and they parade around. And this is incredibly violent in comparison to what we saw in the American Revolution. So if you remember when we talked about the extra legal forms of protest in the American Revolution, we talked about, for example, when the Sons of Liberty had hung an effigy of Andrew Oliver in the in the town center in Boston, and we talked about how these rabble rousers, a bunch of drunk men, went to the house of Thomas Hutchinson and tore down his house. But as violent as that is, and we actually didn't even, I don't think, talk about tarring and feathering in our class, and that's where you would take someone and pour hot tar over them and then put feathers on them, and it sounds kind of funny, but it was actually really painful. So there are elements of violence, but it is not to the same level of violence that we're going to see happening in France. So this whole idea of murdering this man, stabbing him to death, cutting off his head, putting it on a spike and parading it around, tearing down this prison, is a level of violence that we had not reached in the years of rebellion in the United States. Now, this particular incident is going to encourage people in other parts of France. So far we have been talking about these members of the National Assembly who are meeting in Paris. Now there are people all over France who are going to start advocating changes in the way that France is governed. The aristocrats of the country, many of them, the nobles, are going to be scared for their lives. So many of them will flee. They'll flee France. King Louis tries to raise a counter-revolutionary army. Okay, so he essentially wants to fight back. If there's anything you want to highlight on this slide, it would be violence erupts and fall of the Bastille. This is still celebrated in parts of Europe today. In July, it's called Bastille Day. That's the American term for it, but it is a holiday commemorating the French Revolution, and not the violence of it, but more so the changes that come as a result of it. Okay, so we're going to get some revolutionary changes in the government under King Louis. So he is still in power here. We get a Declaration of Basic Rights. It's called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. You don't need to write that, but if you're curious and you want to think about it or look it up, you are very welcome to. It's available online. And we now have a constitutional monarchy in France. The quote here on the side, not only was France the richest, most powerful, and most populous state in Western Europe, but its revolution was also more violent, longer lasting, and ultimately more influential. I think really pertains to European history in a way that we won't be discussing in our class. If you ever take a European history course or Western Civ 2, you will most likely discuss the French Revolution in more detail than we are talking about here. But it is, as I said in class last time, this revolution that was so influential that some scholars will use it as a bookend, right? So as I told you, we have this reference to the 19th century as the long 19th century, that it's not necessarily the year 1800 to 1900, but it's 1789 to 1917, starting with the French Revolution and ending with the Second Russian Revolution by the Bolsheviks in 1917. Okay, so now we have the French Republic. So under this new government in France, we have increasing secularization. And if you do not know what secular means, it means non-religious. You don't need to add anything here, but I just want to talk about it for a minute. Essentially, the participants in the French Revolution are going to very often view the government, the monarchy, and the Catholic Church as being sort of equally corrupt together. So they are going to view symbols of Catholicism as also symbols of the monarchy, right? Because the Catholic Church had held up the monarchy, had supported the monarchy, had approved of the monarchy, and vice versa. So you're going to see increasing secularization, and I think I mentioned this a bit last time in class about how you would see like people who had biblical names might think about changing their names to something that wasn't religiously related at all, that type of thing. In the early 1790s, so by the time we get to 1791, the royal family actually tries to flee, and they are They are discovered, someone recognizes them, and they are apprehended, and they are returned to Paris. And it's at this point where their intention was really to get to Austria, to get reinforcements to help reestablish all of their power. And I'm putting this very simply. There's a lot more to it, but for the purposes of our class, this is really all that you need to understand. So essentially what happens is the king and queen and their kids are trying to go undercover and flee the country, get help, and come back with reinforcements. I had a professor in graduate school who, anytime he talked about the French Revolution and the monarchs trying to flee, he would say they were so stupid. They stopped along the way to pick flowers, and I don't know how they didn't think that they would get recognized. So they do. They're recognized. They're arrested, and it's at this point where people in France who had up to this time been sympathetic to the king or had wanted to give the king a chance really lose a lot of respect for him. The fact that he tried to flee and tried to get more troops to come down and to come into France and support his reinstitution of his sort of absolute power. That's really the way they saw it, and the way they felt was very frustrated. So you get a lot of protests. In 1792, the violence is going to intensify. And two things are going to happen that I would highlight. I'll give you a minute to write. Okay, if you're still writing, that's okay. I don't think you need to add anything. These two bullets here are pretty self-explanatory. But this is where we start to see the execution of people who are perceived as enemies of the French Republic. So people who are against the spirit of the revolution, the spirit of making the country more free and equal in the minds of the revolutionaries. They are going to start to target and kill people who oppose them. In addition, King Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette will individually be tried and executed. We are going to see a period that is called the Reign of Terror. And this I would also highlight. What I'm trying to get across to you here is how intense and huge this violence is. Huge isn't the right word, but the violence is intense, and it lasts long enough for thousands of people to be executed. And this is so much different from the experience that we saw in the United States. The deaths that are that happen in as a result of the American Revolution are almost all the result of warfare, right? Once you get into war and you have the two sides shooting at each other. I mean, there are some small exceptions, not small, but the number is small. You have the deaths at the Boston Massacre. You have this 11-year-old boy who was shot and killed, and then he had this large funeral in Boston. This is sort of like right before the Boston Massacre happened. Okay, so there are a few deaths as a result of these years of rebellion, but it is nothing like what we see here with all of these people being executed. So the Reign of Terror is really a time when thousands of perceived enemies are executed. They're imprisoned and then sent to the guillotine. If you want to write guillotine in your notes, remember it's that device where people put their head down and then the metal comes down and chops off the person's head. I'm sure there's probably a more technical term for metal, but I don't know what it is. So guillotine, if you want to write it, is Guillotine. Um, okay, during the Reign of Terror, we have thousands of people executed. We have the leaders of the revolution trying to, quote, republicanize everything. In other words, make everything about equality and symbols of the revolution. That's where you really see, you don't have to write this, but basically church property is taken away. Priests and nuns are strongly encouraged to stop being priests and nuns. There are laws against the clergy. There's a new calendar written because the calendar is based on the birth of Jesus Christ, right? And so the revolutionaries are going to create a new calendar, and they're going to name the months after like mythological gods and goddesses, so that type of thing. Even like coins for the country are going to no longer have um, any symbols or references to the monarchy. It's going to be more about revolutionary symbols. What they're really trying to do is replace Christianity with what they see as reason. Okay, so they're trying to encourage people no longer to see Catholicism and even more generally Christianity as something that's beneficial and related to the way the state is controlled, the country is controlled. Now, like I said, I've skipped a lot. I've talked about what is most important in relation to our class in general, but more so the way I tend to write exams, so that you'll be best prepared for the test. So when I have here the last two bullets, I'm not really going to discuss a whole lot about how the revolution dies down or ends. But two things that I just want to mention are that one, France is going to go to war with Britain in the early 1790s. This will be important because the United States feels that it has to take a side here, and that's going to create a rift in American politics. At the end of the 1790s, you're going to see the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, and this is in France. So the chaos, essentially, you don't have to write this, but the chaos of the French Revolution is going to leave this void or create this circumstance in which a dictator is able to rise to power and take over, and will actually lead France on a series of wars called the Napoleonic Wars. And that is not really something we will talk about, but we will discuss this war that France is having with Britain in regards to how it relates to our politics in the 1790s. Okay, I think this is probably a good place to stop this first part of the lecture, so I'm going to stop here. It's just, like I said, easier to upload. And then I'll put two more segments of this on YouTube as well.